Over 120,000 Iraqi Jews were airlifted to Israel between 1950 and 1952 during Operation Ezra and Nehemiah, one of the largest Jewish population transfers in history. The community they left behind had existed in Iraq for 2,600 years. Most left everything they owned. Hedy Lamarr was photographed in 1944 at the peak of her Hollywood fame. The actress, who had also co-invented frequency-hopping spread-spectrum technology used as the basis for modern Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. The studio system promoted her face. It ignored the patent she filed in 1942. Welcome to the British Gallery channel. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss out on more videos like this one. 4 students rode a Ferris wheel in Kiev in approximately 1986, with Soviet apartment blocks visible behind them. Boris Gradov photographing a summer afternoon in a Ukrainian city that was, at that moment, downwind from Chernobyl, which had exploded weeks or months before this photograph was taken. Oklahoma Governor Alfalfa Bill Murray deployed 5 National Guard companies during the Red River Bridge War in July 1931, a genuine armed standoff between Oklahoma and Texas over a toll-free bridge. Murray personally blockaded the bridge. The dispute lasted 2 weeks and was resolved without casualties. An elderly North Korean woman and her grandchild wandered through the rubble of their Pyongyang home after a U.S. air raid in 1950. The Korean War's bombing campaign eventually destroyed 75% of Pyongyang. The city was rebuilt entirely in Soviet architectural style after the armistice. Ion Antonescu's body was photographed moments after his execution by firing squad in 1946, the Romanian dictator responsible for the Holocaust in Romania, which killed up to 400,000 Jews and Roma. He was convicted of war crimes. The firing squad carried out the sentence on June 1, 1946. Palestinian refugees killed in the Sabra and Shatila massacre were buried by the Red Cross in Beirut in September 1982. Between 700 and 3,500 civilians murdered by Lebanese Falangist militias, while Israeli forces controlled the surrounding area. An Israeli commission found Ariel Sharon bore personal responsibility. Union soldiers staged a choreographed brawl for James Gibson's camera near Falmouth, Virginia, in 1863. The photograph, titled "A Muss at Headquarters," documenting Civil War soldiers performing for the camera, with the self-awareness of men who understood that the photograph would outlast the performance. WWI Drum and Bugle Corps veterans reunited in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan in 1978, 60 years after the armistice. The men who had played music through the war gathered again for a photograph that James Amos composed with the same attention he gave everything else he documented. U.S. soldiers of the 84th Infantry Division advanced through Duisburg, Germany, in April 1945, the rail splitters pushing through the Ruhr Pocket in the war's final weeks, clearing a city that had been one of Germany's most important industrial centers and was now rubble, requiring infantry to move through carefully. Corneliu Zelia Codreanu founded Romania's Legion of the Archangel Michael and the Iron Guard, the fascist movements that combined Orthodox Christianity with violent anti-Semitism. King Carol II had him strangled in 1938, his corpse disfigured with acid and buried in concrete to prevent his followers from creating a shrine. Gerd von Rundstedt sat at the Nuremberg trials in 1945, Germany's most senior general with 52 years of service, who had known about plots against Hitler without supporting or opposing them. Medical grounds prevented his trial from proceeding. He was released in 1949 and died in 1953. Bruno Mussolini was 23 when he died in a flying accident in 1941. The son of Benito Mussolini, photographed lying in state. The Italian dictator's grief documented alongside a war that would eventually kill the father 4 years later. Bruno had been testing an experimental bomber when it crashed. Bruce Lee posed with his wife Linda and their children Brandon and Shannon in the 1970s, the family photograph taken during a decade when Lee was redefining action cinema globally. Brandon Lee was killed on a film set in 1993. Shannon became a martial artist and actress. Both inherited the name. Japanese women bikers in the 1980s occupied a subculture called the Bossozoku, female motorcycle gangs who built their own aesthetic from leather, customized bikes, and deliberate transgression of the expectations placed on Japanese women. The photograph documents a community the mainstream press consistently misunderstood. Arnold Schwarzenegger, Wilt Chamberlain, and Andre the Giant stood together on the Conan, the destroyer set in 1983, three of the most physically extraordinary humans alive photographed in one frame. Chamberlain was 71, Andre was 74, and Schwarzenegger at 62 was the smallest man present. Mexico designed guide uniforms for the 1968 Olympics with an aesthetic that has become one of the decade's most recognizable graphic design achievements, the op-art pattern and color scheme created by Ants Wyman becoming the visual identity for the games held weeks after the Tlatelolco massacre. Rammstein photographed with Russian model Yulia Stepanova during production of the Son video in 2001, the song that reimagined Snow White as an industrial fairy tale with the band as the Seven Dwarfs. The video was banned from several German television channels and became one of the most viewed metal videos of its decade. Andras Toma spent 55 years in a Soviet asylum for speaking what staff considered gibberish. It was Hungarian. A Slovak visitor in 2000 recognized the language and identified him. He had been captured in 1945. He was returned to Hungary, died in 2004, and never fully understood what had been done to him. Heathrow Airport, photographed from the air in the 1950s with its original 6-runway configuration before the terminal buildings were constructed, the infrastructure of post-war commercial aviation visible as geometry from above, the airport that would eventually become the world's busiest international hub, still in its earliest functional form. Margaret Emerson, former wife of Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt SR, teed off at the Breakers in Palm Beach sometime between 1918 and 1928. The socialite photographed at leisure in the interval between a world war and the Depression, in the specific Florida playground that Gilded Age wealth had built for itself. Two Union soldiers shared cigars in 1864, the photograph capturing an intimacy the war permitted between men who lived in close proximity under conditions that removed most social distance. The cigars are positioned in each other's mouths with the casual ease of people who have stopped noticing the camera. English schoolboys encountered physique model Steve Coates in 1964 and collectively lost the ability to compose their faces. The specific expression of adolescent boys confronted with a body representing a physical possibility they had not previously considered real. The photograph is a document of encounter with the genuinely unexpected. Mount Rushmore was photographed in 1929 when only Washington's face was partially complete, again in 1940 when all 4 presidents were finished, and again in 2025, 96 years of the same mountain, documenting what the intervening decades agreed and disagreed about the 4 men carved into it. Nikola Tesla's last known photograph was taken in 1943. He had 33 cents to his name when he died alone in the New Yorker hotel. He held over 300 patents and had invented the alternating current electrical system that powers the modern world. The gap between his contribution and his compensation was total. Some Toronto gas stations refused to sell fuel to larders after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the Canadian consumer protest targeting the Soviet-made automobile as a proxy for the Soviet government. The larder owners caught between the invasion and the gas pump had generally not invaded Afghanistan themselves. Olivia Newton-John and producer Alan Carr attended the Grease premiere party at Studio 54 on June 13, 1978, the film that became the highest-grossing musical in history at that point, featuring a song about summer romance that Newton-John performed with a conviction that made the film's logic feel inevitable. 1942 diner full of people eating from small plates at a time when rationing, physical labor, and the absence of processed food produced a population whose relationship to eating was determined by circumstances rather than choices. The fitness visible in the photograph was a product of scarcity, not wellness culture. 2 men played chess during the Siege of Sarajevo in 1994. The siege in its 3rd year, 1,425 days total, snipers on the surrounding hills, the game providing the specific concentration of something that demands complete attention inside something that otherwise demanded the same thing for survival. Pond's medicated tampons in the early 20th century contained opium, belladonna, and hyoscyamus, the active ingredients providing genuine pain relief through drugs the medical establishment had not yet classified as dangerous. The Pharmacy Museum in New Orleans preserved the example as evidence of a pharmacological era with different risk calculations. Soviet children received ultraviolet light therapy in schools and clinics throughout the 1980s, a state-organized public health measure designed to compensate for vitamin D deficiency during long northern winters. The children wore protective masks. The practice was widespread. It was presented as science and administered with bureaucratic regularity. White Americans attacked the Greenwood district of Tulsa for 2 days in 1921, burning 35 blocks of what was called Black Wall Street, killing up to 300 people, injuring 800, and leaving 10,000 homeless. No white attackers were arrested. No compensation was paid. The event was suppressed from Oklahoma history books for decades. Australian soldiers carried hot soup to reserve. B troops near Messens, Belgium on January 22, 1918, the soup representing the logistics of maintaining fighting capacity in conditions where cold and mud killed men as reliably as shells did. The Messens Ridge had been captured the previous June. The soup was still necessary in January. Margot Robbie was photographed on her 13th birthday in 2003 reading Harry Potter. The Australian girl who would become one of Hollywood's most bankable stars, photographed 12 years before The Wolf of Wall Street, entirely unaware of what the camera would spend the next 2 decades confirming. Ronald McDonald posed with fast food workers in Staten Island in 1973. The character that had been McDonald's mascot since 1963, photographed among the staff of a restaurant chain that was in the middle of its most aggressive expansion. The mascot and the workers inhabited the same frame with different relationships to what it represented. When Pretty Boy Floyd's gang attempted to rob the black-owned bank in Boley, Oklahoma in 1932, Floyd had warned them the town's residents were sharpshooters. The gang went anyway. The townspeople shot back and repelled the robbery. Floyd's assessment of Boley was correct. His gang's confidence was not. A mother carried her baby in the late 1960s or early 1970s. The photograph preserving the specific posture of someone carrying a child that belongs to a particular decade's way of dressing, a particular light's way of falling, and a particular camera's way of recording both simultaneously. Jackie Ormes was the first black female cartoonist in the United States. Her strip Torchy Brown ran in black newspapers beginning in 1937, featuring a stylish protagonist navigating racism and injustice with intelligence and wit. The mainstream press ignored her. The black press published her for decades. Fisk University students gathered in their dining hall in 1900. The historically black university in Nashville, photographed at a time when its graduates were among the most educated black Americans in the country. Fisk had been founded in 1866 by the American Missionary Association to educate freed slaves. Rashid Mahdi photographed Sudanese people between the 1950s and 1970s, a Sudanese photographer documenting his own country during the decades of independence, the military coups, and the civil conflicts that defined post-colonial Sudan. His portraits treat his subjects as people worth the full attention of the camera. They are. Zeta Phi Beta initiated new members in a ceremony unchanged in its essential elements since the sorority's founding at Howard University in 1920. The Divine Nine of Black Greek letter organizations representing a tradition of scholarship, service, and community building that has persisted for over a century. Young people laughed together on the New York subway in February 1959, Angelo Rizzuto photographing the specific unguarded joy of people who have forgotten the camera is present. The subway was the city's common ground, carrying every version of New York simultaneously through the same tunnels at the same time. A young woman posed with her dog for a portrait in the 1890s, the glass negative preserving the specific ease of a person with an animal that has agreed to remain still long enough for the exposure. The dog cooperated. The photograph survived them both by more than a century. A mother posed with 2 children in the 1890s. her son holding a toy gun, her hat representing the decade's fashion, the glass negative preserving a Sunday when someone arranged this family for a camera that required them to hold still long enough to be recorded. A little boy posed in a sailor suit with a walking cane in 1927. The cane was either fashion or necessity, the caption hoping for the former. The sailor suit was formal dress for small boys in the 1920s. He wore it with the complete seriousness the outfit demanded. Redd Foxx, Eddie Murphy, Sidney Poitier, Bill Cosby, and Richard Pryor gathered at a charity softball game in 1989. 5 black comedians and actors whose careers collectively spanned 5 decades of American entertainment, photographed together in the specific ease of people who have nothing left to prove to each other. Florence Griffith Joyner wore the purple one-legged suit during the 1988 Indianapolis trials, the fastest woman in history, setting world records in sprints while simultaneously redefining what an Olympic athlete could look like. Her Barbie doll wears the suit. The suit was as deliberate as the speed. Duane Michels created the Illuminated Man in 1968, his sequential narrative photography transforming the single frame into a story that unfolds across multiple images. The series used light as both subject and metaphor, the Illuminated Man existing somewhere between a documentary subject and a philosophical proposition about visibility. Tony Vaccaro photographed Georgia O'Keeffe at Taos Pueblo in 1960, the painter who had been living in the New Mexico desert since 1949, photographed in the landscape that had been producing her most significant work for over a decade. The desert and the painter had found each other completely. Martha Holmes photographed Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner drying dishes in their Springs, Long Island farmhouse kitchen in 1949. The two painters, who were each doing the most significant work of their careers, photographed in the specific domestic ordinariness that the art world surrounding them was simultaneously mythologizing. Hans Namuth photographed Jackson Pollock working in his studio in 1950, the photographs that introduced Pollock's drip painting process to a public that had never seen an artist work this way. The photographs changed how America understood what painting could be. Pollock hated having his process documented. Tony Vaccaro photographed Jackson Pollock sitting on his studio floor in East Hampton in 1953, 3 years before Pollock died in a car crash at age 44. The studio floor was where the paintings happened. Vaccaro caught him in the space where the work lived between the making of it. Thurman Roten photographed New York skyscrapers in 1932, the Empire State Building completed the previous year, the skyline at its most dramatic before subsequent decades added more towers. Roten composed the steel and glass as landscape. The Depression was running below the frame. The buildings stood above it regardless. Abraham Lincoln was shot on April 14, 1865, and died the following morning. Anwar Sadat was shot on October 6, 1981, and died the same day. Both were killed at moments of apparent security by political violence rooted in decisions they had made that their killers considered unforgivable. A Passover Seder was held for newly arrived Jewish immigrants in Boston in 1921, the ritual performed in a new country by people who had fled pogroms in Eastern Europe. The Hebrew words were unchanged from what their ancestors had spoken. The city outside was entirely new. Pol Pot bought his wife a watch in Beijing in 1988, the Cambodian genocide's architect living in Chinese-backed exile while the country he had depopulated was still recovering from what his regime had done to it. He died in 1998 without facing trial. The watch purchase was documented. A sniper warning sign stood in Sarajevo in the early 1990s, the siege running for 1,425 days while the international community deliberated. Snipers killed civilians in bread lines, water lines, and crossing open streets. The signs documented the specific danger of existing in the open in a city at war with itself. A Filipino mother and her bayoneted infant were photographed in Paquil, Luzon on April 9, 1945, Technical Sergeant Edward O'Brien's caption noting, "She appeared to have fallen forward attempting to protect the child." The Japanese military's actions in the Philippines in 1945 killed an estimated 500,000 civilians. An American delegation faced Japanese officers during the surrender of Bataan on April 9, 1942, the largest surrender of American-led forces in history. 76,000 Filipino and American soldiers became prisoners. The Bataan Death March that followed killed between 5,000 and 18,000 of them before they reached the camps. Japanese prisoners were brought in from the Shobu Group in Baguio City in 1945, stripped of outer garments as a precaution against concealed weapons. The Shobu Group was the last organized Japanese force in Luzon, holding out until the formal Japanese surrender in September 1945, despite the hopelessness of their position. Japanese Fugo incendiary balloon landed near Point Roberts, British Columbia, in April 1945, one of approximately 9,300 paper balloons launched by Japan toward North America. Around 300 reached the continent. One killed 6 civilians in Oregon in May 1945, the only World War II combat casualties on the U.S. mainland. Japanese-American Nisei soldier Lincoln Taira instructed Japanese POWs to contact remaining comrades in Marikina in August 1945, using a captured Japanese map in the days following the surrender announcement. The Nisei soldiers of the Military Intelligence Service translated, interrogated, and negotiated throughout the Pacific War while their families were in internment camps. The Plaza Hotel stood at 5th Avenue and Central Park South in 1899, 1 year after its opening, before the automobile, before the subway, before the city it overlooked became the city it would become. The hotel is still there. The city it opened in no longer exists in any recognizable form. A U.S. Navy sailor examined a captured German Goliath remote-controlled demolition vehicle on Utah Beach in June 1944, the miniature tracked device designed to carry explosives to Allied positions. The Goliaths had limited effectiveness due to easily severed control cables. The sailor's examination reflected the Allied tendency to thoroughly investigate captured technology. Serbian Orthodox Christians in the independent state of Croatia were forcibly converted to Catholicism by the Ustaše regime in 1941, the Croatian fascist government that murdered between 300,000 and 700,000 Serbs, Jews, and Roma. The forced conversions accompanied systematic mass murder throughout the NDH's existence. Conquering Bear of the Oglala Lakota was photographed by Moore and Reinhardt in 1899, 23 years after Little Bighorn, in a decade when the Lakota's formal sovereignty had been legally eliminated but not experientially finished. The photograph preserved a presence the legal system was actively working to erase. Marilyn Monroe worked as a hostess for the Holger Steel Company at the Pan Pacific Auditorium in Los Angeles on September 5 and 6, 1945, one of her earliest documented jobs before the modeling career that preceded the film career that preceded everything else. The camera spent 2 decades recording. Zurich riot police faced sustained student unrest in 1983. The youth movement demanding an autonomous cultural center had been producing confrontations since 1980. The Zurich youth riots were among Europe's most sustained urban protest movements of the decade. The shields held. The protests continued. The cultural center eventually opened. Union soldiers staged a choreographed brawl for James Gibson near Falmouth, Virginia in 1863, the Civil War soldiers performing for the camera with the complete awareness of men who understood the image would travel. The brawl was theatrical. The war that surrounded it was not. Gibson recorded both. Marie Hogue was a Norwegian suffragist and photographer who posed in her studio with short hair and a dagger around 1890, decades before Norwegian women won the vote in 1913. The dagger and the cropped hair were deliberate provocations. The glass negative preserved someone who understood exactly what she was doing. August Sander photographed a German pastor's wife in 1920, his systematic project People of the 20th Century, attempting to document German society through occupational and social typology. The Pastorenfrau exists in the frame as both an individual woman and a representative of a social category Sander was cataloging with sociological precision. George Gillette wept on May 20, 1948, as he signed away 155,000 acres of Fort Berthold land for the Garrison Dam. The chairman of the Tribal Council coerced into a transaction that flooded the most fertile land on the reservation and displaced 80% of the 3 affiliated tribes' community. A military hut was moved in camp in Greece in 1916, the Salonika Front, where Allied forces had been stationed since 1915 in a campaign the Germans called the largest internment camp in the world. Moving the hut was routine logistics in a campaign that consumed 4 years and settled nothing. August Sander photographed a master joiner in 1938, 5 years into Nazi rule, the carpenter standing in his workshop with the tools of his trade arranged around him. Sander's project was documenting German social types at the precise moment the Nazi state was attempting to replace social complexity with racial ideology. An unknown woman was photographed in a lapped crime photo from the 1930s-1950s, part of a large collection discovered relatively recently documenting cases, suspects, and scenes from decades of Los Angeles policing. The images exist as bureaucratic evidence. The woman in this one is unidentified. The file is her only record. A young woman posed beside a car on a city street in the mid-1940s, the automobile and the dress and the particular angle of afternoon light combining to produce a photograph that belongs entirely and unmistakably to its decade. The car was someone's pride. The pose was hers. U.S. Navy divers decompressed after a 240-foot dive to the USS Monitor wreck off Cape Hatteras on July 27, 2002. The ironclad that sank on December 31, 1862, with 16 crew members, lying on the seabed for 140 years before divers recovered artifacts, including the revolving gun turret that had defined the vessel. Charles Bronson appeared in Japanese commercials for Mandem Cologne throughout the 1970s, the actor whose stoic masculine image made him one of the most recognizable faces in Japanese advertising. The commercials ran for years. Bronson was paid significantly more than his American films offered. He returned annually to film new ones. A small boy sat on train tracks in South Korea in 1952, the Korean War's second year, in a country whose infrastructure had been systematically destroyed by 3 years of advancing and retreating armies. The tracks he sat on were among the most strategically significant targets in the peninsula. He was simply a boy on tracks. Ladies learned to roller skate at Rockefeller Center in 1940. The rink converted from ice to roller surface for the summer, the learning curve visible in the postures of women who had volunteered for something that offered significantly less predictable traction than they had anticipated when they arrived. J. Kelly Pinkerton murdered 2 women. Texas in 1979 and 1980, at 17 years old, tried as an adult, convicted, and executed in 1986 for the first murder. He was 24 at the time of his execution. Texas executed him under laws that the Supreme Court later ruled unconstitutional for juveniles. A German policeman explained during post-war interrogation that he had been cowardly, that he had shot Jews at Józef in 1942 because he lacked the courage to refuse the order. His unit murdered over 83,000 Polish Jews. The courage required to refuse was available to him. He acknowledged he had chosen not to use it. Buchenwald was liberated on April 11, 1945, after prisoners had already revolted and seized control. Patton ordered comprehensive documentation of everything found inside, every body, every room, every face. He understood that without the photographs, someone would eventually claim the camps hadn't existed. The photographs he ordered have made that claim untenable. Margaret Freyer ran through burning Dresden in February 1945, repeating one sentence in her mind: "I don't want to burn." The firestorm killed between 22,000 and 100,000 people in 2 nights of Allied bombing. She survived. She remembered the burning. The sentence she couldn't stop saying became the testimony she eventually wrote down.